All right. Well, what a beautiful day we have for art of weeding, sustainability and resilience virtual gathering. We are going to keep everybody that's joined on mute. Please enter your name, your group, and your email into the chat. And as we get started, we will be taking questions throughout the session through the chat. We'll keep everybody on mute. You can submit questions, any questions that come up, and then we'll have some time at the end for some additional questions. And then if we have a little bit more time, we'll do a little bit of a tour of the garden just so you can see what's going on right now and what's growing and what's getting ready to be planted. So welcome everybody. I'm Kathy Wicks, the Director of Sustainability for UMass Dining and Auxiliary Enterprises. And on site are my team, Tyler Tedesco, the Regional Food Systems Coordinator, and Dan Bensonoff, who's going to be leading the workshop, is our Permaculture Gardens Manager. Again, we're going to be talking about the art of weeding. Please submit all questions. This is an important topic. So submit your questions through the chat and we'll answer them as they come. All right, without further ado, Dan, you want to take it on?
Yeah, hi everyone. Good morning and welcome to a beautiful May day. It looks like we're finally out of that cold spring weather. We have at least a good week of really nice weather. So great time to be getting outside, to be getting into the garden. And I want to talk about weeds today. And I know that seems, like maybe a strange topic to talk about, but it's such an important topic. For one thing, I think that we have so much to learn from these plants that we refer to as weeds. To me, they really are a great teacher. And I want to talk about why that is today. But of course, I also know that a lot of us are really frustrated by weeds, whether it's in our garden, whether it's in our lawn, in our vegetables, wherever it might be. A lot of people really struggle with controlling weeds. I've seen a lot of home gardeners have this great plan. They put all these plants in the ground in the spring, and then come late summer, they are just overwhelmed. And so I want to offer some strategies today that will help make sure that you spend time in the garden the way that you want to spend time, whether that's just enjoying yourself, harvesting, and you're not overwhelmed by things that, by weeding and other tasks that make it a little bit less enjoyable to be out there. It's really quite easy to control weeds if you have the right approach and if you really understand some of the basic principles. So we'll talk about that today as well. I also want to talk about some of the specific weeds that you are likely to encounter in your garden. You see, I have some arranged here on our table. We're going to talk about them later on. We'll maybe see some others out there as well. Each of these plants, which we refer to as weeds, has a lot of really important virtues. So we'll talk about some of them, and hopefully you may have some questions as well that you want to offer. And then as Kathy mentioned, I'm going to try to leave some time at the end for a quick walkthrough to show you what's going on in the garden, what's growing right now, what we're harvesting, and hopefully even leave you with a few possible jobs for the weekend so that you know what you might, be able to get yourself into, whether it's planting or doing some weeding this weekend, or mulching, or some of the other things that we'll talk about that we've been doing over the last week or so out here in the Franklin Permaculture Garden. So first of all, let's talk about what is a weed, right? I think a lot of us already have a general image of what it is. It's some rank plant growing in a place where you just really don't want it to grow. And in its most basic definition, you could say a weed is just a plant that's out of place, right? And of course, that is a human construct because we decide what that place is and what plants shouldn't be in there or should be in there, right? I think a really useful other definition is one that comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And he said that a weed is a plant whose virtues have yet to be discovered. And I really like that definition because there are truly so many virtues in these plants that we refer to as weeds. And it's important to understand that these constructs change over time. What's a weed? What's a cultivated plant? Those boundaries have really shifted over time. Let me give you a few examples. So when wheat was first being cultivated thousands of years ago in Europe, one of the most common weeds in a wheat field was what we now refer to as rye. Rye is another grass that looks very similar to wheat, and so often escaped weeders' eyes because it kind of blended in. Now, of course, we use rye for all sorts of things, right? We make rye bread, we do all different kinds of things with the flour, and it's a really important commercial staple grain around the world. But originally, it was the bane of wheat farmers' existence. And only much later did people say, okay, well, actually, maybe this is a useful plant that we want to get to know. Another interesting example of that is a plant called Galansoga or quickweed. That's a plant that overwhelms a lot of vegetable growers in the summertime. It doesn't quite come up this early, but once the heat kicks in, my God, it can just completely overwhelm a vegetable bed in a few days. And yet where it comes from in Peru, it's one of the most important green vegetables that they grow in some of those areas. And it just happened to escape cultivation from that area and become a weed when it was first introduced into Europe, and then eventually came back to the US and became a weed here as well. So these categories, they change over time. So I think it's important to go into weeding with a really fresh eye, not thinking that something is already almost always going to be a weed, but really thinking about each plant on an individual basis and thinking about what is it doing in this situation? Is it harming the plants around it, or is it perhaps providing some kind of benefit even? And what might be some of those benefits or virtues of a weed? Well, one thing is that a lot of really common weeds in a garden or on a lawn are actually edible. And in fact, I think it's so ironic that some people spend so much time weeding, and yet what they're weeding out are really delicious edible plants. So for example, we have spinach growing right behind me here. And one of the most common weeds that we find in our spinach is a plant called lamb's quarters. And you might be able to show that plant later on. But lamb's quarters is a very common weed, and it happens to taste exactly like spinach. So the irony there is that we spend hours and hours pulling these plants out that are actually almost exactly the same flavor and grow much easier than the plant that we're cultivating. So it's really worth getting to know what you are pulling out, because it might just be as delicious or more delicious than the plant you're growing right alongside next to it. And in fact, it's almost always going to be more nutritious if it is edible, because weeds haven't been bred for yield. They haven't been bred to be good storage vegetables. They are wild, meaning that they are so nutrient dense, they still retain all of their nutrition from their wild state. So really, really good for our health as well. Aside from being edible, a lot of them are also medicinal. We'll talk about a few medicinal weeds later on. Some of them are extremely common. Some of them are also excellent indicator plants, meaning that they can tell you a lot about what's going on in your soil without you having to do any kind of testing. I'll give you a few examples of that. So one plant that we have that's fairly common in our garden is a plant called dock, curly dock, or there's a few different kinds, but it's a very common weed. You can see a little wilty here. It has this really deep taproot. Can't quite see it here because it broke off when I was trying to pull it out. But we have a lot of that here, and dock is a great example of an indicator plant that tells you your soils are very heavy and very dense, and usually very compacted as well, meaning that they've been walked on a lot, or that they tend to, reduce the amount of plant growth that can go in there because they're so heavy. Some plants tell you that your soils are either really acidic or really basic. Some plants will tell you if you have a lot of fertility in your soils. Stinging nettle, which we'll talk about later, is a great example of a plant that tells you you have a lot of nutrition in your soils, a lot of extra fertility. So you can really learn a lot just by walking around and observing what's there. Some plants are excellent fertility builders. We actually use a lot of our plants to cycle back into our system. So whether that's bringing them to the compost bin and making really good quality compost. Or I want to offer you one other strategy. This is something that we just did yesterday. I just want to show you what we did here. So one of the permaculture principles that we often employ here is something called, the problem is the solution. Now, weeds we usually think of as a problem, but they're actually fantastic if you want to introduce more fertility. So we weeded a lot of stinging nettle, plant we're going to talk about later on. I just put them into this 14-gallon trash can here, and I'm going to fill this up with water a little bit later on today and let that sit for 1 to 2 weeks. And what we're basically making is nettle tea there that's going to ferment, turns into this brown, it's fairly smelly, but it is incredibly good fertilizer. Once it's been sitting for a week or two, we drain this off, and then we feed it to our plants. We actually have to dilute it because it's so strong. We add usually 1 part nettle tea to 20 parts water, and we feed it as a beautiful, soluble fertilizer right to our plants, and they absolutely love it. They just immediately start growing so quickly as soon as we give them some of that nettle tea. We do that with quite a few of our weeds.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How do you spell the first weed that you talked about, dock?
Dock, yeah, that's D-O-C-K. D-O-C-K. I believe the Latin is Rumex, R-U-M-E-X, I believe. And there's a few different species. They're all all have this, have this deep taproot. Most of them are medicinal, really good for your liver especially, and they all indicate that your soils are heavy and compacted for the most part. Great plant to get to know, extremely common. You can find it just about anywhere in the country, and usually within 30 feet of you, you've got a dock growing somewhere. So some of the other benefits. These are, weeds tend to be excellent wildlife plants. So right now, there's a lot of open, bare soil in our gardens, and that's not really ideal for wildlife. Wildlife wants cover, they want flowering plants, they want lush growth, and weeds really can provide a lot of those functions. So one of the most common plants that we have that's providing pollinator food right now is a weed called Creeping Charlie. Hold a little bit of it right here. It's a very common weed in our gardening and throughout America, and it flowers profusely this time of year. And if you walk through a patch of Creeping Charlie, you'll usually find just dozens and dozens of bumblebees and other kinds of pollinators in there. And without those plants, they would have much less options of forage in our garden. So they're excellent for pollinator food. They're great habitat sources for wildlife. And they just cover the ground, which means that the soil underneath will stay more moist and will generally be healthier than if it was bare and exposed. So we have a lot of virtues there, right? There's a lot to it that we can learn, that we can benefit from working with these plants. So I really think it's important that we get out of this mindset of weeds being bad, right? Those are our own constructs. And we really need to approach each situation on an individual basis to decide what is the best thing here to do for this land, for the wildlife, and of course for yourself as well as the gardener. It's important that the space continues to be productive, that it looks good. So all of those things need to be taken into account. Of course, there's also a lot of drawbacks to weeds, right? There is a reason that we call them weeds. And the biggest thing really is that they reduce the amount of nutrition that gets to your crop. So if you have a dandelion, for example, growing right next to a pepper plant, then that dandelion is going to be taking up a lot of the nutrition that was destined for that pepper, and it's going to be putting it into its growth. So in that sense, we really want to be limiting the amount of competition. It also takes up a lot of moisture from the soil. So particularly in the hot summer months, it is important that we weed around our plants, that we really need to have access to moisture, because otherwise they're going to be really suffering. Another possible drawback is that weeds can shade out your plant, especially if they get much bigger than whatever plant you are growing intentionally. So you really want to make sure that they are limiting, you're limiting their size, because you want to have full sun exposure, or you want to have good access to sunlight for most of your plants. Lastly, it also makes it a little bit more challenging to harvest. So let me give you an example. Over here, we have our mint patch. We just actually weeded it earlier this week. So you can see there's not too many weeds in here. And the reason that we weeded it right now is because we're actually going to be doing our first mint harvest as early as next week. And mint is an incredibly aggressive plant. In fact, mint is one of those plants that crosses over between being a crop and being a weed, right? Usually we grow it because we love mint, but it can also become a weed very easily because it is so aggressive. So we weeded this plant not because actually of any competition issues. Mint can outcompete just about any plant. However, when we go to harvest this plant next week, we want to be easily able to just cut all of this mint right at ground level. And if there's weeds growing in there, we're going to be spending a lot of time picking those weeds out before we're able to really, to do something with that mint. So in that sense, it's really important that you weed to make it easier to harvest, especially something that you're going to just be kind of mowing down. Something like arugula or spinach where you tend to just cut them right at the base. If there's a lot of weeds in there, you're going to be doing a lot of work. And again, the idea here is that we want to be lazy gardeners, in the sense that we want to enjoy ourselves in the garden and do what the tasks that we enjoy without really struggling and weeding excessively, right? Some weeding, though, is essential. So we'll talk about when and how to do it really effectively to be efficient as possible. So let's talk about some of the first principles, the big ideas that will really help you to have a weed, I wouldn't say weed-free environment because we're not shooting for that, but an environment that is conducive to the plants that you are trying to grow, and also it maximizes the efficiency of your time in the garden. The most important thing that I want to stress today is the idea that you want to cultivate before weeds become a problem. It's essential that you get in there before you barely even see the weeds. And only then are you really trying to do the weeding. So if you wait until the weeds are already big enough that you can clearly see them, you've waited too long and you have easily tripled or quadrupled the amount of time you're going to be spending weeding. So we're going to talk about that in a second, but let me first kind of go over a few tools, and then I want to show you a demo of how we weed before it's a problem. And before we do that, I think it's important that we go over some of the tools that we use. So first of all, I want to say that there are so many tools out there for weeding in the garden. Some of them, honestly, I think are just a waste of money, and some of them I think are really, really useful. So I want to show you some of the tools we have, and I'll give you a review of the ones that I find to be extremely useful and in what situations, and some tools that I find to just be really non-essential. So I want to start with the long handle tools. I brought 3 different hose out. I really recommend everybody have at least one long handle hoe. Even if you have a very small one raised bed garden, these are the most effective tools for most jobs. So the tool that I want to start with is one that we use for weeds when they are just germinating, which is, again, the best time to be doing your weeding. This is called the diamond hoe, and there are some similar models. Some of them are called collinear hoes. Whatever you call it, this is a tool that cuts just underneath the soil surface as weeds are just germinating. So I want to actually do a demo with this tool, and then we're going to go over some of the other ones, because this is the tool that we tend to use as our first line of defense against weeds. So why don't we come over to our spinach patch?
So Dan, that's when they're just popping out of the ground?
Popping out of the ground. So I'm going to show you here. This is our spinach patch right here. And you can see the spinach coming up. And it looks fairly weed-free probably. I don't know how well you all can see, but if you zoom in really close, I'm going to show you. This looks, you're going to say, wow, really? That's worth weeding? That weed has just germinated. It has barely even grown out its first set of leaves. And you can see it pulled out so incredibly easily. And this is the ideal time that we want to be weeding, because if we wait another week, at that point, I'm not going to be able to really use this tool anymore. What this tool does so well is it just barely cuts underneath the soil surface. I'm absolutely using no effort right now. All I'm doing is going back and forth, maybe a 1/4 inch under the soil, and I'm just gently cutting all of those weeds that are just just now starting to come up that you can barely see. So you can see I just did one pass. I'm going to do one more. And it's quite easy to get into kind of fairly small rows here. I'm using no effort really at all. And I do this about once a week, especially if it's been pretty hot, because the weeds will be coming up really quickly. And it's really, if I do this once a week, I will not have to do any hand weeding here whatsoever. You know, maybe a couple weeds will come up right in the spinach row, but for the most part, I won't have to do any work other than this. You'll see this will take me all of 2 minutes to weed this entire bed of spinach. And if I didn't do this now, if I waited till these weeds grew up to the point where I had to hand weed, I would be spending maybe half an hour to do a really adequate weeding job in here. So, and this does a fantastic job. The other thing that it does is it breaks up any crusty soil on the surface. So it really lets moisture get in too. I got one more row to go. And what's happening is that as those weeds are pulled out, uprooted, they're going to bake in the hot sun, and they're going to be killed very quickly. If I did this when it was raining, those weeds would immediately re-root, and I would have the same weeds growing back very quickly. So an incredible tool to get to know. This is honestly one of my absolute favorite tools for weeding. Now, a few things to keep in mind about these light hoes. Again, this is called a diamond hoe, but collinear hose is another one that has the same exact function and used the same way. First of all, notice my grip here. A lot of people tend to do this kind of grip where your thumbs are facing down and you're pulling like this. I find that to be really ineffective. I really find that having both hands with your thumbs pointing up to be the most effective grip. So notice the way that I'm holding that. That will really help. And the handle of the hoe should be roughly your height. If it's too short, you're going to be bending over. And ergonomics is really, really important to keep in mind, especially for folks who have bad backs or otherwise struggle bending over. You really want to be in a comfortable position when you're weeding or doing any garden work. And so I find that a hoe with a handle that's roughly my height does the job really, really well. That way I'm able to stand upright. I'm not hunched over at all. Really good posture. And it feels extremely easy. In fact, I would honestly say that I really enjoy the process of hoeing with this just because it's such a useful tool and it does such a great job. So it doesn't feel like work at all. So that's the diamond hoe. Let's look at some of our other hoes here as well and try them out. So the next tool, I would say the second most important tool in our arsenal is what's called a stirrup hoe. It's another long handle, so it's a little shorter for me, a little too short, I would say. And this has a swinging blade. It just goes back and forth a little bit. And this is for slightly bigger weeds. So I'm going to show you what I use it for. So in this area here, this is a perennial patch here. We've got some St. John's wort that we're cultivating. And you can see in here, I've got some grass growing. And actually not even sure what this is here. But I want to definitely get rid of this grass here because this grass will spread very quickly. And grass is one plant that I really do try to minimize in our vegetable and perennial beds. So I'm just going to go through right in between those plants. And I'm just going back and forth a little bit there. And you can see what happened is that this plant just came right out with that root system. And as long as that is baking in the sun and uprooted, it'll die very quickly. So it's more of a back and forth motion than the other one. And it really does a good job of getting about an inch under, so slightly bigger weeds. So I could do this whole bed very quickly if I wanted to. Show you real quick. And again, I'm not too bent over. This is, I wish it was a little taller, but so be it. So really effective for slightly bigger weeds. Incredible tool. This is the stirrup hoe, also sometimes known as the scuffle hoe. A last long handle tool is one that I think a lot of gardeners have. And honestly, I do not find it very useful. So this is another type of hoe. It has a lot of different names. Some people call it a peasant hoe. Some people just call it a hoe. And I find it to be extremely ineffective for weeds. It's really good for moving soil around. So If you have one of these, you can use it for digging up areas. And if you have a really big weed that you're trying to remove, it could be useful for that. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to remove, I'm going to use this St. John's wort here as an example because it's been creeping over a little bit. So I could just kind of chop that down right there. But you can see one thing is that it took so much soil with it. It's not precise at all. And then I have to move it around. It doesn't really turn it over well. It just doesn't do a great job. So honestly, I do not find these to be extremely efficient. If you have one, you find a use for it, but honestly, if you don't, I don't think it's worth the investment. Then there's also some hand tools. I find most hand tools not to be very effective at weeding. I would honestly encourage everyone, even with a small garden, to get at least one long-handled hoe, preferably either a diamond hoe or a scuffle hoe or collinear hoe. But if you have hand tools, some of them can be useful at times. I find these tools right here, these are meant for really getting out deep weeds. These are useless in my opinion. So I would avoid these guys. I find a lot of these tools that are used for kind of getting into the soil. So I'll show you, these are meant to be used similar to the long-handled collinear hoe or diamond hoe, but it's a lot of work to be near the plants like that. So, and if you're bent over, that's really gonna be hard on your back over time. So I really don't find these to be very useful. The one tool that I do find useful as far as hand tools go is what's called a hori-hori or a weed knife. Now, this is an incredible tool to have if you're working in a garden setting. It's a fairly sharp tool. It has a serrated blade on one side, and you can use it for both digging, so it's kind of like a trowel, but you can also use it for cutting deep weeds. That serrated side and that sharp edge allows you to get really deep in there and get a deeply rooted weed, cut it really nicely. So I find it to be really useful. I'll show you how I use that. So if I, for example, wanted to, let's say I'll take another, we have a lot of St. John's wort here, so I'm gonna reduce a little bit. You could just kind of cut right underneath it, and then I could just flip that whole thing over and leave it on the surface like that, or I could pop it out. Here's another weed. You could pop that out, put that in the compost. Or what I often do is just put them as a mulch underneath the bed, let them dry out and die right there. So I just threw that underneath our peach tree. That weed will add to the fertility of our peach tree over time there.
Dan, a couple of questions coming in. One is, can you say the name of your weeding knife again?
Yeah, so this is originally it was a Japanese tool, and it's called a hori-hori in Japanese. So it's H-O-R-I, H-O-R-I is the spelling. But if you search weed knife, then you'll probably find the same tool. And really it is, I find, the best hand tool to have around for weeding. It's the only one that I use. I don't use any of these other ones. Between this and a couple of those long handle tools, that's really all I need. I do use my hands occasionally. I'll tell you situations when I use my hands, but for the most part, these are the best tools for the job in my opinion.
Great. And then another question is about best practices for getting dandelions out of lawns.
Yes, great question. So the dandelion question, and that kind of gets again to that central point of what is the purpose of getting it out, right? So, and this is going to somewhat betray my personal feelings about lawns, but I actually encourage dandelions in lawns, or I should say I don't discourage them, because they're actually doing a lot of function there, right? They're mining deep into the soil, so they're actually able to bring fertility to the surface. They're creating pollinator habitat, right, or sources of nectar. I think that they also make lawns more beautiful personally when they're flowering. So there's some interest there. So I would say really, first of all, it's important to think about, do you really want to get rid of it? If you do, then I would say your best bet is to use a weed knife, and you're going to have to use it several times because dandelions do have a deep taproot. It's very hard to get the entire taproot out. So usually what I do is I'll just pop it out with one of these, and it will regrow once or twice. But if you're diligent, if you do it a few times and you pop that dandelion out once or twice more afterwards, it won't come back anymore. But that really is, aside from herbicides, the only way of getting dandelions out. You really have to get as much of that taproot out as possible. And they can go quite deep. They can get about a foot down to the ground. So you have to get in there and kind of pop them out with whatever leverage you have. So a short knife or a knife with a serrated blade is really useful, I find. These kinds of hoes will not really do much for dandelions. Great
Is there
question.
anything that you can do with the dandelions if you do decide to pop them out?
Yeah. So I actually had dandelions for dinner last night, specifically the green. And I parboiled them for a few minutes in water. So just threw them into boiling water, took them out after a couple minutes, and then I dressed them with some soy sauce and a few other things. And they were delicious. For some people, they're a little bit on the bitter side, and I find that that boiling process really helps. You can also mix them with other greens to balance them out, like something like kale or spinach is a good addition. So you can eat them, and they're incredibly nutritious for you. You can also make a weed tea, like I described earlier with our nettle, putting them into a bucket, filling them with water, letting them ferment for a week or two, and then putting them out to your plants. It's great fertilizer. Or, you could always, of course, just bring them to your compost bin. So those are, I would say, the best options. But in the springtime, especially, the greens are very delicious. And I recommend mixing them with other greens because, again, they're pretty strong, but they're so deeply nutritious that I find them just to really replenish my body after winters. They're one of the best, I think, for doing so.
Awesome.
So try them out if you've never tried them before. And of course, you can even buy dandelion greens in grocery stores these days.
One more question. Can you just go over again the kind of the rules about if you dig up a weed and you let it, you leave it there, when it will reroot, when it won't reroot, and when you should just move it to the compost or do something?
Great question. Yeah. So this gets to a few of the other kind of principles that I wanted to talk about. One is that it's really important that you do any weeding on dry days, dry, sunny days, ideally. Because if you're weeding on rainy or overcast days or days when the soil is really moist, you're going to oftentimes just be doubling your work because those weeds will often reroot. So I think it's really important that you weed during when the temperature is right. So let me explain a few options for what you can do with your weeds. So let's come back over here and let me pull out another weed here. So let's see, got this plant that's called here. So if let's say you're doing some weeding, you have a few options. One is that, of course, you can bring it to your compost bin. It's important to keep in mind that in the compost bin, if your compost isn't heating up really well, if it's not really well balanced and not very healthy compost, you may have a lot of weed seed in there if you're pulling up plants that have already a lot of flowers. Weeds are weeds because they're extremely quick growing for the most part and really, really good at reproducing massively. So I oftentimes don't necessarily encourage people to put weeds in the compost because you may end up proliferating your weeds, because if you have a lot of weed seed in your compost and you put that compost back out, you may end up just creating a perfect environment for them to continue growing. So you could put them in the compost, or you could just leave them on the soil surface where they'll dry down and die. So if I was weeding, something like this, if I left it out there, by tomorrow that would be completely wilted and would be barely recognizable. And at that point, it would just break down and come back into the soil. So that's one option. But what I often do is I'll gather my weeds and I'll either put them into a pathway. So not so much in this situation because here we have a stone pathway. So it wouldn't really work in this situation. But in a lot of our garden beds, we have pathways that are just essentially mulch or, soil pathways. You could just pile your weeds up there and let them just break down right in place. That's one of the easiest ways of doing it. Or in this kind of situation, what I often do is I'll gather up my weeds. So let's say I'm taking out, I have some violets here, and maybe I'll keep the violets, but maybe I'll take out a few of these weeds. And what I often do is just toss them to the nearest area that I think of as being an area that needs some mulch and additional fertility. So we have a peach tree right here. I often just toss my weeds right underneath the peach tree. They'll die on the surface. They'll slowly release their nutrients back into the tree where they can be absorbed. And at that point, they'll just be part of that soil structure there. So really, just to recapitulate, I think your best options are composting your weeds, leaving them in pathways. Doesn't look very neat, but it works really well. It's easy. Or putting them as a mulch underneath other plants. So those, I think, are the best options. If you're weeding tiny, tiny little weeds, there's no reason to gather those up at all. Just leave them right on the surface. They'll break down so quickly you won't even notice them. Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we talked about some of the principles of really effective weeding already. Disposing of them properly, we talked about. Cultivating before it's a problem, so when they're just very tiny. It's really important also to reduce the amount of tillage that you're doing if you want to really reduce your weeding. So tillage is any time that you're going in and really mixing up your soil. So whether that's with a shovel or with a rototiller or whatever else you might be using, if you're really mixing up your soil, you're actually encouraging more weeds to grow every time you do that. Because what's happening is that all of the weed seeds that are dormant and buried deep in the soil, those weed seeds usually can't germinate. Most weed seeds need some sunlight and really good access to that surface level to germinate. So if you're flipping your soil, what happens is that all of those weed seeds that were deeply buried are now on the surface and are able to germinate really quickly and rapidly. So every time you till, every time you mix up your surface, you're going to get a proliferation of new weeds growing up. So we really try to reduce the amount of tillage that we're doing to reduce the amount of weeding. That's really important. The second thing I want to mention around that is the importance of not letting weeds go to seed. So if you see a weed already flowering, so this is an example of a chickweed plant that I pulled out just a little bit. You can see there's tiny little flowers there, and believe it or not, there's already hundreds of seeds being developed on this one plant. If I left this plant on the surface, or if I brought it to a compost that wasn't getting very hot, I would be introducing hundreds and hundreds of new seeds to my compost or to my soil. So I really want to try to kill weeds before they produce flowers at all. At that point, they won't be creating any new seeds. If you see them flowering, that already usually means that they have already created some seed or are likely to do so. Some weeds are so strong that if you kill them while they're flowering and if they haven't created seeds yet, they can actually continue their life cycle after they've been uprooted and killed. So they can actually go from flowering to seed after you've already taken them out of the ground. So really important that you want to try to weed before you see anything flower. That way you can reduce the amount of weed seed in your soil over time. And every year you do that, it's going to get easier and easier and easier because you're reducing the amount of seeds in that soil bank. So you want to try to get them before they're flowering. And lastly, you want to cover bare soil wherever appropriate. So usually that means mulching with some material. Now you can see we have not mulched most of our beds right now. And I wanted to make that distinction because it's not always appropriate to mulch. We mulch in the summertime for the most part. And the reason being that in the summer, it's much hotter. So it's more important, and weeds are also coming up much more quickly. This time of year, in the spring, we actually are trying to warm our soils up. So the best way to warm your soil up is by leaving it exposed for a little while. And once the summer comes around, those soils are going to be nice and warm. We're going to put some straw or hay or shredded leaves, whatever we have, around our plants, which will be much bigger by that time. So it'll be easier to see them. And if we have a really thick mulch cover, 3 inches to 6 inches of mulch, those seeds are not going to be able to germinate that are underneath that mulch because, again, they need light to germinate. So I do recommend using thick mulch, but when appropriate. So for me, that means after spring, during the warm months. And I don't use mulch for all plants. I use mulch for larger, more robust plants, for tomatoes, for peppers, for potatoes, for zucchini. all of those plants are really big and robust, and I use mulch for all those. I don't necessarily use mulch for something like leeks, which we have growing right here. They're so delicate, they're very small, and if you try to mulch them, it's quite challenging to even get mulch around each plant without burying them. So it's a little bit more challenging for really fine plants. So you have to use it appropriately. But mulch can be an incredible way of reducing the amount of weeding you have to do. There's a lot of different materials you can use for mulch, everything from cardboard to shredded paper to sawdust, wood chips, a lot of different sources of mulch out there. Any questions so far? Okay.
So we have one question that just came in about what are the small plants? Those are the leeks, right?
Leeks, yeah. Yes, we have a lot of leeks. We planted those about a month ago at this point. And you can see they take a long time before they really take off. They look like one little leaf of grass right now. And so at this point, we want to leave them exposed. We come through here with a light, long-handled hoe once a week and just scratch up the surface. And that means that we won't really have to do any hand weeding at all for months here. So at that point, it'll be really easy just to go through and quickly pull out any weeds. But it's a really effective way of keeping something like leeks or onions weeded well. I want to talk about what to do if you have an overwhelmingly weedy area. Some of us are starting off with gardens that are just completely covered with weeds. And those are really challenging situations to work with. So a few strategies that I found to be extremely effective. There's a few ways that you can just cover the soil and really quickly reduce the amount of weeds growing. Those strategies are called solarization and occultation. Let's talk about those for a second. So solarization basically means putting a clear tarp, basically plastic, on top of bare soil and just leaving it there for about a month. And what happens is that underneath that plastic, you're basically creating a greenhouse effect. And those weeds, it's going to get so hot, they're going to germinate very quickly, and they're going to immediately be killed because underneath that plastic, on hot, dry days like today when the sun is out, it's going to easily get 150 plus degrees. And so you're basically going to cook all of those weeds as soon as they germinate underneath that clear plastic. And very quickly, you're going to rapidly reduce the amount of weeds that are growing in that area. So a really good way of just passively reducing weeds in a place. So let's say you wanted to grow a big garden, but you had just tons of weeds growing there. You could just roll out some clear plastic and leave it there for a month, maybe 2 months even. Come back, it'll be completely spotless when you return. Great way of doing that. Occultation is basically the same thing, except you're using a black plastic or tarp material. And essentially what happens there is that those weeds will germinate from the heat, but they won't have access to any light. And so again, they will die very quickly. And that way you'll reduce the amount of weed seeds that are in your soil very, very quickly. So any kind of black tarp that you have, I actually bought one this year from a website that sells used billboards. You can get them quite cheap. They're, a billboard that is no longer in commission. You can roll it out, and in a month, everything under there is going to be completely clean, and you can start growing a beautiful garden or start a new grass patch, whatever you want to do. Trees in the ground, shrubs, and you'll have no weeds to deal with at that point. Great strategies for quickly reducing weeds. And the other thing I would say, I want to talk about herbicides for a second. I know a lot of folks, turn to herbicides, particularly for something like Japanese knotweed. Perennial weeds that are just extremely vigorous. They're so hard to get rid of. And, of course, I think a lot of us know that herbicides do come with an environmental cost. They do run downstream, they get into our watershed, and a lot of them are deeply toxic to wildlife, not to mention to humans as well. So I do discourage them to use them. There are occasions when a very, very small amount of herbicide could save you, a lot of time. But I find the most effective strategy for something like Japanese knotweed is just to come through once a month and knock them down to the ground and really reduce the amount of vigor those plants have. If you do that for about a full year or 2 years, just once a month, knock them down. Doesn't take very long, a few minutes. You can use any kind of tool that you have that will just kind of cut them right down to the ground. You're going to reduce the amount of energy those plants have, and after a year or so, those plants will give up the ghost, and you'll have an area that you can then really start to cultivate. But you do have to do that for a while. Some people do choose to use a little bit of herbicide. If you cut down a plant and you rub a little bit of herbicide onto the cut plant tissue, then that plant will die very quickly. That way you don't have to spray a lot of herbicide. You can just rub a tiny bit on right onto that plant. It'll absorb into the roots, and that plant will die very quickly as well. So there are situations when it could be really useful to use herbicide in a very, very judicious way. But for the most part, I find that you can really use cultural practices, just knocking things down or having the right tool for the job. So I want to talk about some of the common weeds that we see around us and some that I think are really useful to get to know. It's still pretty early in the season, so some of my favorite weeds, and it's kind of seems like an oxymoron to say favorite weeds. I do have some favorites because some of them are actually some of my staple foods in my diet. They're not up quite yet, but I want to talk about some that are coming up right now and some of the functions that they might have for us. So let's start with one of my absolute favorite weeds. This is a plant called stinging nettle. I can show you what it looks like when it's growing as well. Come right over here. So here's a patch of stinging nettle. These plants are brought over from Europe, and they are all over the world at this point. Very easy to find. And one thing that really helps you identify them is that they have thin hairs along the stem. And those hairs, when you touch them, can give you a bit of a prickle that will last for sometimes an hour or more. They don't hurt so much as just sort of, I don't know, feel a bit uncomfortable. Some people refer to them as 7-minute itch for that reason. Stinging nettle is an incredible weed. It grows all over the place. We're surrounded by it. For one thing, it's a great indicator plant for really fertile soils. It usually tells you that there's a lot of nitrogen and a lot of other fertility in that soil. So that's a really good sign. Now, I eat a lot of nettle this time. It's one of my favorite plants to eat. Tastes very much like spinach. I know I said that about a lot of plants, but it just sort of has a bland green flavor, but it's incredibly rich in iron and a lot of other important trace minerals and nutrients, much, much more so than a lot of the common greens you eat. So nettle, great one to get to know. You can harvest it this time of year, anytime really before it flowers. And what I do when I harvest it, by the way, I always wear gloves when you're harvesting nettle. I don't have my gloves with me, but if I did, what I usually do is I would just cut it about halfway down on the stem. I would harvest those parts, and I cook it, usually either saute it or parboil it, then add whatever you want to add, maybe some butter, maybe some vinegar, maybe some soy sauce, whatever you have that you like to flavor your greens with. I like to mix spanakopita with it as well instead of spinach sometimes. It's just such a delicious green, and it is one of the most common weeds that I find all over the place. So great plant to get to know. I also use it for tea. So when it gets a little bit bigger, I'll just dry them and I'll drink them throughout the winter. And it's a really great source of iron, particularly for those who are a bit anemic, like my partner is. So we drink a lot of nettle tea throughout the winter, especially. So that's nettle. Let's talk about a few of these other ones here. So we've got some why am I blanking on the name here? I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of a brain fart. Let's come back to that one. The name will come back to me. Let's go to this one here. This is dead nettle. So dead nettle is often referred to as lamium, which is the Latin name. And this is another edible weed. And I wanted to show you because it flowers beautifully this time of year. We have it all over the garden. And it is a really great source of nectar for bees. And again, you can cook it down just like you would spinach or arugula or chard. And it tastes very mild. It's really, really nice to eat. So if you find this plant, it has these like kind of monk's hood-like flowers, very small purple flowers. And you can just chop it right down to the ground and cook the whole thing. So really, really nice to grow.
So you can eat the flowers too, Dan?
Flowers as well. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so let's come back to this. My finally figure out what the name of this is. This is plantain, very common weed. Some of you probably have seen this before. Grows in a lot of lawns. Usually this tells you that, again, there's a lot of compaction in the soil. Tends to be found where there's a lot of walking traffic because we get all the footsteps tend to compact soil. Plantain is an excellent plant to get to know if you ever have any insect bites or mosquito bites, anything like that, scratches. If you just take a leaf and you apply it as a poultice, it's very good at soothing your skin if you get bitten by a bee or a mosquito, anything that causes inflammation. Just take a leaf off, rub it up a little bit or chew it, apply it there for a minute or two, and it will immediately create some relief for you. So excellent one to know because it really comes in handy. I mentioned a few of these other ones. So I would love to take questions if anyone has questions about either specific weeds or what to do in really troublesome situations. And if there's no questions, I'll show you around the garden for the last few minutes.
Dan, have you ever dealt with false strawberry? It's like a vine that crawls across the...
False strawberry. I've seen, I'm not sure if that is the common name. We have a plant here that sometimes is referred to as cinquefoil, and it does look a lot like strawberry. There's also one called Barren Strawberry, which is also very similar to strawberry, but doesn't produce any fruit and is fairly distantly related. I haven't dealt with it too much, so I don't know if I have specific instruction on there, but those are all perennial plants for the most part. So perennial weeds, usually you do need to actually dig out of the ground, and I tend to do that with my weed knife because otherwise they will very quickly grow back. And there's really no other way to do it other than pulling them out. And then if you can, as they start to come back out of the ground, you can come back in with a hoe and just kill that top foliage. If you do that a few times, eventually the root system won't have enough energy to sustain itself and it will die. So you can try to hoe it, but for the most part, I would recommend if it's big enough that you can really identify it, usually by that time you need to pop it out of the ground with the roots and all.
Okay, great. I have another question coming in about ferns, frilly ones that have taken over. Can you transplant or just compost? The root balls are quite large. Any suggestions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So why don't we actually come over and take a look at our ferns over here? I wonder if they're the same kind. There's a lot of different ferns out there. Some of them are really useful to have in a garden setting, some are not. But I want to show you what we have here. So this is one of the more common ferns in New England. This is called ostrich fern. And this is also where fiddleheads come from. So if you pick these when they're very young, they're a really nice edible plant. If you have these growing, they do spread very quickly. In fact, a lot of ferns tend to spread rhizomatically. So they will colonize an area, which basically means that if you want to use that area for something else, if you want to try to cultivate it with a different plant, then you really do need to pull them out of the ground. And I would recommend trying to really either pulling them out and immediately planting them and then hoeing around your new planting for the first few months, or using cardboard to really smother those plants after you chop them down. So if I wanted to, let's say, turn this into a vegetable garden plot, what I would probably do, since the root system is all over here, I would chop these plants right to the ground, and I would probably put some cardboard down, and if I had any compost, I'd lay some compost on top, or I'd maybe mulch right on top of that cardboard. Let that cardboard smother those plants for about a month, and at that point, I would just plant right into the cardboard. The cardboard will be nice and soft by that point, so you can actually just plant right into it. You don't have to remove it. Just leave it right on the ground, let it decompose, and whatever you're gonna plant, let's say you're planting a rose or some flowers, you can just use a soil knife like this and jam it right through the cardboard. That will be nice and soft by then. Put your plant in the ground and let it grow. And the cardboard will smother everything else in that area. That's a great strategy for really tough to deal with weeds that usually tend to spread quite a bit.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Hey, if there's no other questions, we could show you a little bit about what we're up to this week, so that if you're looking for some tasks in the garden, you might have some inspiration.
Great, that sounds good. I don't have any other questions right now, but if others come up as we're touring, I'll share them with you.
Great, so why don't we come over here and take a look. Our student garden coordinator, Cam, is busy. Cam, do you want to tell us what you're up to in the garden?
Yeah, so today I'm planting dill in this bed and cilantro in this bed. So far I've made some furrows in the ground about 6 inches apart. I'm just going to put 1 or 2 seeds per inch right into the furrows and then cover them up, pat them down, and give them some water.
Excellent. So this is a great time with the warm spell coming up this week. This is an excellent time to be doing some direct seeding in the garden. Tomorrow we have rain, so we really thought about when we want to plant these. With the rain coming tomorrow, and then I think we have a lot more rain coming next week. The weekend's supposed to be sunny. This is an excellent time to put any direct seeded crops in the ground. So carrots, beets, spinach, arugula, cilantro, dill. These are excellent plants because they don't require a lot of heat, but they do require a little bit, and they require some rain to really get going. So if you're not sure what to do in the garden, you might want to consider planting one of those. Of course, you can also start transplanting. Next week is probably the earliest you'd want to consider putting your tomatoes in the ground. So if you have some starts of tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, wait at least 1 more week before you start putting those in, because again, they really do like the heat. So I would wait a little bit. The other thing that you might want to consider doing, if you have some peas growing, is putting a trellis up. So let me show you what we did. We just put our trellis up yesterday in the garden. And this is a really easy way of trellising peas. We also do this with a lot of our climbing beans. You can also do this for cucumbers, by the way, or melons or winter squash. Anything that wants to climb up, you can quickly put up a trellis. So we cut down some sapling trees from a patch of woods nearby. And these are actually 2 years old now, so we've been able to use these multiple times. And we just pounded them into the soil using a mallet. And then we stretched some you can use hardware cloth or any kind of mesh material, whether it's plastic or metal. We just strung them around. We put a little bit of wire on the edges, and this will stay here all season long. So you can see our peas are starting to get a little bit bigger. They're about 4 inches tall now. In about a week or two, they should start to reach for that trellis. They'll climb up. By the end of July, we should be done with peas. We'll have picked them all. We're going to rip the peas right off the trellis, and immediately we're going to plant cucumbers in this bed. And those cucumbers are going to be able to use that same trellis. So we're able to make double duty out of this all season long. And those cucumbers should produce well into September for us. So great time to be thinking about how to create some vertical growing space in your garden as well this May. So I'm going to leave you with those 2 tasks. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Happy to talk more about weeds, but hope you've been inspired to really rethink these categories that we've created and really start to think about plants on a more individual basis and think about what virtues they might have for you. Perhaps you can eat your weeds. Perhaps you can use them as medicine. Perhaps you can use them to really see what's going on your land, to really think of them as indicators, as teachers. And of course, to handle them appropriately. So when necessary, we do need to do some weeding, and we want to be able to do it efficiently and smartly so that we enjoy being in the garden and it doesn't feel arduous. So with that, I want to thank you all for tuning in today and wish you all happy gardening and hope you enjoy being outside this weekend.
Thank you so much, Dan. So informative.